Welcome to TFE Talks, Navigating Wealth, Business, and Legacy, the podcast from Thomas Fisher and Edwards. Each episode, our attorneys bring you expert insight on estate planning, business strategy, and legacy building, breaking down complex topics into clear, actionable advice. Whether you're solidifying a strategy we've discussed or preparing for what's next, this podcast is your resource for thoughtful, practical planning. You ready? Let's dive in.
Hello and welcome to another edition of TFE Talks. I'm your host, Jordan Goway, and I'm joined today by a shareholder here at Thomas Fisher and Edwards, David Thompson, recently elected as a shareholder of the firm. And David, that's not the only accolade that you've received recently. You have also been named as a certified specialist in estate planning and probate law by the South Carolina Supreme Court. So congratulations to you on both of those accomplishments.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, it's really exciting, and the start of the year that all came to fruition. And I'll flip it around and play host for a minute because we got the same accolades for you actually. So also named a shareholder start of the year, and then certified specialist in estate planning and probate law. So a lot of good things ongoing here at the firm, and a lot of good accolades for the attorneys here. So it's been an exciting last couple months.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that recognition. And for our viewers, this is probably not the only thing that you're noticing that's different. This is the first broadcast or podcast that we've done that is live and in person here with both of us. And so I'm looking forward to this formatting and getting to share the room with you and talk about our topic today. So with that said, let's move on to the actual topic for today, which is choice of business entities. I just mentioned we're both now certified specialists in estate planning and probate law, but a large portion of our practice deals with working with closely held business owners. And so we help them with their estate planning, but we also help them with their businesses. And probably the first step when it comes to helping someone with a business, especially if it's a new business, is choice of entity. And if it's someone that comes in with an existing business, then it's important to understand what type of entity they have, both from a state law standpoint and from a taxation standpoint. And so there's a lot of complexity on this topic, and for that reason, we're going to do a two-part podcast on this topic. And so here with part one, let's start with the very basics. David, if someone is starting a new business, or if they just start engaging in business, if they start a lemonade stand, if they start a landscaping company or a lawn mowing company or something like that, and they just hang a sign out and start going to business and start charging for their services, what type of entity have they created at that point in time, and why is that maybe a bad idea?
Yeah. So, and before I even answer that question, I'll say what we're going to talk about today is a lot of the default classifications. When people just start carrying on a business in some form or fashion, there are default rules that apply when they maybe haven't evaluated or affirmatively made the decision themselves. And in the case that Jordan just kind of brought up, the classic example, is you go and start mowing people's lawns, and you're collecting fees. Well, services for those. For the services that you're performing, that's a sole proprietorship, right? You haven't actually really created a legal entity, but you are carrying on and conducting a business, which for purposes of when you're preparing your own income tax return, really that will all show up there, but it's really, you've not created a separate entity or a separate distinct entity or tax structure. So it's all going to show up on your personal return and be treated, almost as an alter ego of yourself, right? Yep. And you've not created any legal separation. And that gets to Jordan's second point, whereas why is that maybe a bad idea? Well, it depends, right? I mean, it may or may not be a bad idea necessarily, but one of the big issues that you'll see with a structure like that is we haven't segregated any problem assets that could create potential liabilities. We haven't kept, we haven't created a limited liability structure, which we'll get into with some of the different other options, corporations, limited liability companies, and LLCs, and then, limited partnerships.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think your point being it's really simple. That's great. You get to report everything on your personal tax return, but with there being no separation from a liability standpoint and with there being no separate entity, you also have not carved off any of the risk for yourself at all. And I think another place this comes up is when multiple people go into a business together, and where you would see that a lot is like in the context of a rental home. Like if you and I, as business partners here in the law firm, if we separately decided to go buy a property that we're going to rent out to people as just residential real estate, what have we created at that point in time, and why is that a problem?
Well, then let's talk about that. So, another default rule is if two people instead of one person go out and start, or two or more, I should say, go out and start operating a business, and that rental real estate is a great example. Me and you go by and we own a rental real estate business or a house, tenants in common, and we start renting that thing out 50-50. Well, it's likely and potential that we've created a general partnership for federal income tax purposes, which again, that actually is a separate, entity for tax reporting purposes. So you'd have to file separate taxation. Now it is a flow through tax entity. So the taxes really shows up on everyone's personal return, but there actually is a separate filing requirement. But we've created tax complexity, but we've done none of the liability planning that we could do with maybe a different structure that has maybe the same tax effect, but gives us some state law liability protection in certain instances.
Yeah, so if something goes wrong at that property, then we are both completely on the hook for it, and whoever is suing could come after our personal assets in addition to the rental property. And we also have to file a partnership tax return, and yet we haven't gotten any of the liability protection that we could get from an LLC or a limited partnership or other types of business entities that we'll talk about in a moment. I'll note that that's something that can often arise accidentally. For instance, if a brother and sister inherit a property from their parents and they decide rather than selling that property, they are going to just start renting it out, they have essentially started a partnership and need to be filing a partnership tax return, and maybe they never really intended to do that or thought that they caused that sort of complexity. So it's sometimes something that happens by accident, and people don't even think about the idea that they are going into business with another person.
We see it with some frequency, right? It's just if somebody's gifted a small interest in a piece of property, or over time, they think, oh, well, they use it too, and then they start renting it out. Well, what have you done? Incidentally, I can make the case that you've started a partnership.
Right. And so you referred to that as a general partnership, and that's a very old law concept, is a general partnership. But then the idea comes about limited partnerships, which is a specific type of business entity in South Carolina. And so why don't you talk for a bit about what a limited partnership is and how that's different from the general partnership that we just described?
So in the context of sole proprietorships and general partnerships, one of the advantages of them is their simplicity, right, that we mentioned, right? You theoretically don't need a lawyer or anybody to really advise you. You can just kind of start doing the business, start providing the service, or however you're going to go about it. And you don't have to necessarily file anything with the South Carolina Secretary of State in the case of South Carolina, or if you're in a different state, maybe it's a different agency. But you don't have to file anything or form anything, functionally. You just start carrying out the business. Now, in order to get the benefit of some of those limited liability protections that we talked about, and segregating those assets from, the business specific risk assets from your own personal assets, it's necessary that you file something typically with the proper authority in the state. In South Carolina, that's the South Carolina Secretary of State. The first limited liability structure that we'll briefly talk about is a limited partnership. That was kind of the first, more well-known limited entity limited liability entity that was created. It's basically, for tax purposes, it's a partnership generally, right? It's created and structured with limited partners and general partners. So going back to the general partnership concept, the general partners have unlimited liability, right? And they are, subject to the rules that would apply to general partners in a general partnership structure functionally. But the limited partners have limited liability, and those individuals are typically going to be, investors and maybe not actively involved in the business, right? So that you see that a lot of times in certain real estate development and other institutional type investment structures and more complicated versions of that.
And so that would be something that would maybe come up and would be helpful if I was going to go buy this rental property and I was going to run it, and I'm confident that there's not going to be any liability because I'm going to run it so well and I'm going to really take care of things. And I'm willing to take on some risk for myself, but I don't necessarily have the money to afford the property. So I reach out to you and say, hey, David, will you kick in some of the purchase price and some of the investment? And now we've created something where you get to invest, but your investment is protected, or you're protected at least outside of your investment.
I'm at risk up to what I put in the partnership is the idea.
But you're not at risk beyond that. Whereas I'm fully at risk, but I'm the one who's really running things. I'm really in control of things, even though maybe I didn't even put in as much from an initial capital contribution standpoint as you did.
Right. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this is a very low level or entry level, surface level conversation, but at a higher level, right, you could theoretically create the general partner in another limited liability entity, right? So there's nothing that says that the general partner has to be an individual, right? It could be a corporation or some other entity that maybe has limited liability. So you can create tiers of structures that potentially provide everybody at some level with some protection in some form or fashion.
Yeah, and in fact, we often do that when we set up what's often referred to as family limited partnerships, or limited partnerships that we use in the estate planning context for gifting strategies and things like that, which can be a future topic of discussion on this podcast, but we won't go into it fully today. So with that in mind, David, let's shift gears to a limited liability company, because in some circumstances, we may not want anyone to be that general partner that's going to have liability, or we may want the general partner to be some other type of entity, as you suggested, that's going to have some liability protection. And so that's where the limited liability company comes in. And so let's talk about LLCs a bit. They're probably the most common type of business entity that we see at this point.
Yeah, so limited liability companies, LLCs, are a more modern limited liability entity, and they're newer typically in most states. And like Jordan said, they're almost certainly the most popular at this point. The context of a limited liability company, just at a high level, we're talking some of the default rules. The flexibility of a limited liability company, we talk about a partnership, like a general partnership or a limited partnership, that implies that we at least have two people, right? So a limited liability company, that can have just one owner, right? So you could create it yourself and be the sole owner. In that case, unless you make additional elections, which we'll talk about in other podcasts or in a brief moment, the default there is that it's a disregarded entity for federal income tax purposes. So for income tax, it's really treated much like a sole proprietorship would be, right? It just kind of flows through and shows up on your own personal return. It's not this separate entity where you have a separate tax return or those things. But the creation of that LLC does allow you to put assets that maybe would create could create liability for you in a separate legal entity, which is segregated from your personal stuff, right? So that's one key difference. What I will mention, and it's good to keep in mind when you're thinking about liability and shielding, creating entities to shield from liability. If I create an LLC and I provide hair services, right, and I cut hair, if I'm the only one providing the services, right, that alone doesn't create limited liability, right? I'm still on the hook for my negligence in performing the services, right? Even if it's through the LLC. But let's say I start a flower delivery company and I hire a driver, and maybe I own the whole thing solely, and I hire a driver and they're driving around a vehicle that's owned by the LLC. Well, as long as there's certain factors that may apply, but typically, right, if they just commit some sort of ordinary negligence, that employee, I'm likely not going to be liable beyond, the LLC's assets or what's in the insurance and the LLC's assets there, because I personally didn't commit the tort or the negligent action. So I think it's very important, because we'll have clients that come in and say, hey, I have this LLC. That means, I'm providing these services. I have limited liability. Well, probably not, though, when you're the personal service provider. And I think that's a key thing to understand and keep in context. Now, LLCs can also have more than one member. In that case, typically the default rules would create that it's a partnership, right? So we would be back kind of in the general partnership or limited partnership world for income tax purposes. But the benefit is that we've created that limited liability structure. And also further, and as compared to a general partnership, and then we don't have to necessarily have a general partner, right? We can have kind of the same class, or everybody's kind of treated the same, and obtains that limited liability structure or protection as compared to a limited partnership.
And so just kind of in summary there, if there's just a single member LLC, it's a disregarded entity for tax purposes. There's no separate tax filing requirement. If there are multiple members in that LLC, then by default, it's a partnership for tax purposes. You have to file a Form 1065 partnership tax return. But unlike the limited partnership, everyone is really treated the same in that they are all limited in their liability with respect to the entity. Another thing I'll note as far as that limited liability that I see a lot of is a lot of times my clients, they come in and they think that the LLC wrapper protects what is within the LLC, whereas really it protects what is outside of the LLC. So, for instance, if they have a rental property that they put into an LLC, they come in with the perception that that rental property is protected from liability, when really it's not. If there was a liability associated with that rental property, the person suing them or the person going after them could potentially take that rental property from them and take any other assets of the LLC. It's really just that they're protecting their other assets outside of that LLC from liability associated with the rental property, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's why you want to create. I mean, and typically the best example is that real property, right? Because those are the types of assets that create a potential for liability. Vehicles and heavy equipment can be another one, segregating certain things in certain instances for certain businesses. But evaluating those high risk assets and keeping them segregated from your low risk assets like cash, marketable securities, things like that may have accumulated inside of a business, or also just the pure value of an operating business, right? The ability to generate income, keeping those high risk assets away from that operating business can provide is good planning.
Yeah, and so that's something I always like to talk to my clients about, because if they come in and they've got multiple rental properties, then I want them to be able to divide up those rental properties into separate LLCs so that they're dividing out that liability. And also, if they have just a large portion of vacant land, I always like to ask, do people hunt on that land? Do people drive ATVs on that land and other things like that? Because if so, maybe we should split that land off into an LLC, because those are inherently risky activities that are occurring on it. And maybe we should have that land held in an LLC, and we should have anyone that's using that land in that manner, sign a waiver or something where they recognize that it's owned, by an LLC. Just because, again, that liability protection is important. And those are things that I think are important about LLCs, even though you don't think of them as businesses per se. And so you mentioned that we were talking about default rules, and that these are the default rules for how LLCs are taxed as partnerships with multiple owners, or as disregarded entities with just a single owner. What elections can be made to take us outside of those default rules?
So, specifically with respect to LLCs, you can actually make certain elections to be either taxed as a S corporation or taxed as a C corporation. We're going to talk more about those tax structures here in the next part, but I think the key to think about is that when you set that LLC up, you are making a choice. Whether you know it or not, you've made a choice. There are other choices that are potentially available to you, right? That have different pros and cons to them, but depending on the structure of your business, may or may not be the right choice. And in that context, I think it's important for individuals to know that are out there, because a lot of clients will set up their own LLCs and then they become more successful and they start having questions. But the act of creating one or structuring it has an effect that maybe you don't want or maybe you do want. And I think that's the key takeaway, right? Is that you're defaulting yourself into some form or fashion, some rule about the taxation of your entity, when maybe when talking to an advisor, you may ultimately come to a different decision or solution if you consult with an expert.
Yeah, and David, my final question was going to be a key takeaway or some key advice for the clients, but I really think that covers it. And that is, just because you are just certain in your mind that I need an LLC for this entity, and you say, you know what, I really don't need to get an attorney or an accountant involved. I know that this is what I need. I'm going to go set this up with the Secretary of State. It's easy enough to do. That may all be true, but you are making tax elections. Essentially, you are making other decisions when you set that LLC up that you may not be aware of. And so it is valuable to consult the help of those professionals to make sure that you're fully aware of what exactly that decision entails.
And I also think too, when you're talking to advisors, or let's say you've created something and you're going in to talk to somebody about your structure, I hear clients a lot tell me, well, I have an LLC. When I ask them how it's taxed, I ask them, say, how's this thing taxed? I say, I have an LLC. That doesn't answer the question, right? And if you don't understand that nuance, you probably need to be speaking to somebody so that you can make sure that you're making the proper choice or what is right for your business.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we're going to talk about corporations, which is a different type of entity with other tax elections available to them in a future podcast. And so, thanks for touching on these topics with us here initially. And I look forward to talking with you in just a moment about corporations, and we'll release that as a part 2 of this podcast.
Thanks for listening to TFE Talks. For more information, please visit our website at www.tfelawfirm.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram by clicking the links below in the show notes. If you have any questions about topics discussed in the episode, or you have recommendations for future topics, please email us at info@tfelawfirm.com. See you next time.